We are super excited to have you here. This is the second in a two-part webinar series. Today, it's over, but we will return for more SEPs. This is focused on the SEP of developing using models, and today's session will be all about scaffolding, developing using models. And to help scaffold our way into this webinar, we're going to start with some introductions. Thank you all for introducing yourselves in the chat. I'm really excited to introduce myself and my colleague, Kate. Hello, everyone. My name is Brendan Finch. I taught for LUSD. I taught middle and high school for 7 years for LUSD and Green Dot and KIPP. And I left the classroom 10 years ago to build rocketlet.com. So it's an adaptive reading website. And then about 5 years ago, we started working on Inner Orbit. And so we just focus on assessments for the NGSS and scaffolding our assessments and scaffolding students up to things like the CAST and the New York State Science Test. And I mean, we support folks in all states that have a three-dimensional science test. That's what we focus on. I wrote a lot of the assessments on the site to start with. Kate has removed all of those because her and her team do a far better job than I ever did, which is amazing. Thank you. I'm currently doing research on better ways to support admin students and teachers with sense making. Some of the work that Kate's going to present here is like there's like a little shard of that larger thing, but we're doing some work and experimenting with some things to support sense making because it's hard. And I also just want to make the statement that coconut water is life. And honestly, it's the best source of potassium. Give me a coconut water over like 2 or 3 bananas any day. I feel like you can only eat so many bananas before you start to not feel good. And anyways, I think everyone should have more coconut water. And you probably don't have enough potassium. I digress. I'm really excited also to introduce my teammate, Kate.
Thank you, Brendan. I'm laughing at you, but I have my coconut water sitting right here. My name is Kate Stevens. My pronouns are she and hers. I am based in Detroit, Michigan, and I taught middle and high school science, mainly biology and chemistry, for upwards of 14 years. I was also a department lead and an instructional coach. And now I am the content manager for Inner Orbit. I'm a lifelong explorer of the natural world, and I'm really, really passionate about improving science content and resources so they are accessible to all students and all teachers. And I guess my controversial statement to kick us off is that candy corns are not, in fact, the worst Halloween candy, but good and plenties are. So I'm sorry to you licorice lovers out there. I'm going to kick it back over to Brendan to get us started, and I'll be back with you in a bit.
I feel like you really could have gone with like licorice lovers, like land lovers, pirate thing, just to keep the pirate thing going. But that's okay. If you came in just before we started, we were making pirate jokes, and now we're done. Anyways, to kick off our webinar, we're going to talk about Inner Orbit for a second, so you know what we do, what we are. This is not the focal point of the presentation. This is just a short interlude to help you understand the way that we approach science education. So Inner Orbit is a website. And on that website, we have 3, and the 4th thing isn't really on the website. But the first are phenomena. So we want to provide students with many, and we have over 1,000 on this website now, examples where they can take their knowledge and apply that to something novel. And that's what sense making is. And when we're talking about scaffolding the SEPs, we want to give students more opportunities. Often your curricula will have a anchoring phenomena that's a single phenomena. And what we want to do are provide additional opportunities to look at additional phenomena. And we make those very, very real world. And they are rigorous, which means they're deep and they're rich. And in order to scaffold students up to be able to approach those phenomena, we've written lots of really deeply scaffolded questions. And we'll talk about some of those questions later on. But the idea is that there are questions that target very specific pieces of the standards. And so, for example, if you're in California and you're administering the CAST, it's really difficult to tell, where students are struggling. So our questions are written to very specific pieces of those standards so that at the end of an assessment, you get a report. So this is the SEP, developing using models. What we're looking at here are 2 different parts of this SEP. So up at the top, we're looking at the 3-5 grade level band. And there are a bunch of very, very specific elements of that SEP where students should be showing success or demonstrating growth. And so what we'll do is we'll measure, say students are 100% successful using a model to test cause and effect relationships or interactions concerning the functioning of a natural or design system, which is great. And then on the bottom, we're looking at the grade level band of 6-8. So where are all our middle school students and how are they progressing in their understanding of developing using models? And so what we see here is there's an area where students struggled more than other areas, which is developing a model to describe unobservable mechanisms. And so if we can target these really specific pieces of these standards, then all of our instruction and even little things like do nows and informal assessments, the language that we use in our classrooms or in PD for our district can be altered to make sure that we're providing students and teachers with exactly what they need and when they need it. And that's kind of what InOrbit is meant to provide. Is we have all these assessments, these phenomena, which is super cool, but this data is what really helps you to leverage your time in the classroom with students and your time with teachers in a very precise and meaningful way. And to make that more meaningful, we often find that professional learning around the NGSS is lacking. And so we have developed a copious amount of professional learning sessions. They're all based on research. So you'll see Achieve articles cited throughout that, or STEM teaching tools, or other things that are authorities in the realm of the NGSS. We model actual classroom strategies, and then everything is driven by teacher feedback. So at the end of every single session, there's like an exit slip, and we pour over every single comment that people make and improve the session as we move forward. And so this is my colleague Erin over in Connecticut delivering a PD session to folks there. If you'd like to chat about those PD sessions, or you want to chat about a pilot of InOrbit, you can click on the calendar link that I just dropped into the chat. And if you're interested in just exploring InOrbit on your own, and you don't have to like pilot it with your district, but you just want to go like poke around, then you can click the link that I dropped in second, which is like the start a pilot link. It's really just allowing you to access it on your own. We want to make InOrbit accessible to everyone to explore because honestly, good science assessments are pretty hard to come by, and we want to help y'all and support you. And with that, we're gathered here today to talk about scaffolding the SEPs in this InOrbit webinar. The SEP that we're focused on today is developing and using models. And in that context, we are going to explore strategies and resources for scaffolding the SEP, developing and using models. It's a pretty straightforward objective. We're going to be here for about an hour. So settle in, get cozy. We're recording this. So if you're watching it as a recording, hello. And if you're here presently and you got to roll, that's fine. We're recording it. We'll send it out to you afterwards. This is the second session in a 2-webinar series. The first session was an introduction to developing using models. That was really intended to provide access. We think that oftentimes, because the NGSS has been out for so long, folks usually just kind of like leap into things like scaffolding, but just defining what an SEP is and using, some of Achieve's who helped to write the standard with state partners, using some of their documents helps to really like clarify what the purpose of all of this is. And then this is leveraging those purposes for actual application. So that's what we're doing here today. But that other session is available on our YouTube channel. Today, we will be talking about sense making one more time. We always talk about sense making. It is so important. Honestly, if there's like one critical thing that I want everyone to walk away with in our webinars is an increasing understanding of sense making. If we could get that, then you're going to better be able to access curriculum and assessments, and that is exciting. We're going to talk about levels of rigor, or really it's these concepts of grade level bands. And we're going to do it through a couple of different lenses. So first, we're going to look at the grade level bands and the progressions. So this is an appendix of the NGSS. Second, we're going to look at some 3D questions using those progressions. And this will be something that y'all can participate in the chat. I can't wait to hear how y'all are thinking about levels of grade level bands in these questions. And then we're going to talk about scaffolding modeling, which is the meat of our session for today. And in that context, we'll talk about one-dimensional questions. We have these questions that we call SEP practice problems, which are kind of interesting. They are practice. They are not diagnostic problems, but they're interesting. And we'll talk about some of our 2-dimensional questions that we write on InOrbit. And this is all just a frame for thinking about how we can leverage those dimensions to scaffold students up to rigorous practices and ideally gather data that we can use to inform our instruction or our PD. We also we'll look at some 3-dimensional multiple choice questions and some 3-dimensional free response questions. We think that there's a place for all of those things, for gathering small bits of data or really giving students like the full experience of sense making. And then we're going to kick it over to Kate, and Kate is going to drop in and talk about scaffolding science practices with students. And so the goal here is to provide you with an actual structure, something you can use to, as somebody said in the chat earlier, to break down the prompt or the whatever the question is into smaller steps. And the goal is to help students to be successful in making progress towards that larger goal of sense making. So we want students to be successful in making progress. And oftentimes those questions are kind of all or nothing, and we want to avoid that. So I'm really excited for Kate to talk about that stuff. But first, we're going to talk about sense making. So this is the baseline for all of these 3-dimensional standards. This section is going to be really short, but it's important for us to understand and sort of conceptualize what sense making is before we dive into the rest of our session. So if you were in our webinar prior or you watched that on YouTube, you'll know that sense making is the binding agent essentially for the ideas and the skills and the ways of thinking about science. And the concept that three-dimensional standards puts forth is that a phenomena serves as a way to bind those ideas together. I learned science as disparate, as like read a graph, make this 3D model of a cell, and then learn all of this stuff about cells. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, etc. What we want students to do now is to take those ideas and those skills and then those ways of looking at scientific phenomena and to connect those things together so that no matter what we throw at them, what phenomena or problems, those ideas are connected. It's not just that they know that within the context of what you taught them, but the ideas are connected, the skills are connected, so that anything they look at, they can make sense of. One of the resources that we went over yesterday from Achieve talks about two elements that come together to make the practices. And those two elements are mechanics and skills, and then having a purpose, a driving purpose. And so in order to properly assess an SEP and give students authentic experiences with SEPs, they need to be using the mechanics of, in this case, modeling, and have a driving purpose. And some of those mechanics are that they can either reference or read a given model, cite evidence from a given model. They can recreate a familiar model. And all of those are, it's a really important litmus test oftentimes to say, can I cover up this model and still answer the question? And if that is true, then even if there's a beautiful model in your question, students are not engaging with the practice. All they're doing is answering a knowledge-only question, and they're representing their knowledge through the context of like some question with something next to it. It doesn't really matter what it is. So if students are engaging, they're actually referencing, citing evidence, or recreating a familiar model, that is great, and those are important things. Then we can move on to the second sort of like aspect of these practices, which is, do students have one of these driving purposes? And here is where we get into sense making. Are students using the model as a vehicle to explain a novel phenomena? Is the model a way to explain how or why something's happening? Are they making predictions based on a model? So here's some relationships. Now tell me what would happen if, and students make a prediction based on that model. Or are they revising a model in light of new evidence or in light of criticism or anything else where they're taking an existing model and they're tweaking it to make it different, to improve it in some way, or to show maybe a different way of representing those relationships? And those are ways now we're having students engage with a driving purpose towards sense making and with actual mechanics and skills of developing using models. That's a lot of information in maybe a minute and a half. But if you want to know more about all of this, we have a whole session. And so we'll drop the link to that recording in YouTube, and you can go to our YouTube channel anytime. If you're watching this as live, we'll send out links to both videos, the intro and the scaffolding one afterwards, so you can take a look at either of those. But onward, we must proceed to levels of rigor. And when we use the term rigor here, really what we're looking at are just differences in expectations at different grade levels and differences in expectations for students as they progress in their understanding and progress towards mastery. And that's kind of the goal. So we talk about rigor here. We're not just talking about having students do tough things. We're thinking about what is appropriate and what will move them forward. And so that's the big lens here. So we use the word rigor, and I know that has very specific meanings, but I want to make sure that that's very, very clear. So when we think about rigor first, and we think about what is appropriate for students at different levels, the appendix, the K-12 progressions, it's one of the appendixes of the NGSS, is really, really helpful. And this takes the idea of developing using models, and it breaks it down into expectations for students at different grade level bands. And you will probably not be surprised to understand that those progress in complexity over time. And so students start in K2, and all of the K2 standards have there's a list of just a few different elements in this appendix, and there are even fewer elements that are in the actual standards, which is a topic for another webinar. But students move from K2 to 3.5 to 6.8 to 9.12. And in each of those grade level bands, there are very specific things that we want to see them mastering. And those things lead into the next grade level band and the next grade level band and the next grade level band. And those are all tied together very, very discreetly as well. And so when we look at one of these practices, we look at the progressions from K2 to 3.5 to 6.8 to 9.12. We'll see things like in K2, students have to, compare models to identify features and differences. And in 3.5, they have to identify limitations of models. In 6.8, so in middle school, they have to evaluate the limitations of a model. So not just to say that's a limitation, but here's why it's a limitation. And then in 9.12, they need to evaluate the limitations of two different models for the same process. So maybe we're looking like a mathematical model and like a physical model, a realistic model versus a model of, like more of a flow chart type model. And so these are different ways that this progresses over time. And so the expectation of, what students should be doing in each grade level band is different. Now, this is important because oftentimes the pitfall that we see is that we'll see assessments that teachers are giving students that fall short of the grade level band that they are teaching. And this is important because obviously we want students to be progressing in their knowledge. And this is where the word rigor comes in, because we want them to be given the appropriate level of rigor for their grade level. You can't just give students something too complex for them. In middle school, you don't want to give something that is an inappropriately low level of rigor unless you're doing it through the lens of scaffolding. So the K-12 progressions are really, really helpful in a way where we can say, okay, what do our students need? And then if this is where they need to be, where should they have been before that? And where can we take them to lead up? So if you're not familiar with the K-12 progressions, this will be included as a resource in the recording, in the description, and you can review that later on. But what I want to do right now is play a little game, which is what level complexity is this question? What grade level complexity is this question? And so I want to throw out, this is one of the phenomena and one of the questions on inner orbit. And I want to throw this out and have y'all in the chat tell me what grade level complexity you think this question is, because it's fun to test our knowledge. And so what you'll write in the chat after I read this question out, and I'll give directions after I read the question. So the phenomena we're looking at is, how does this trap fit into a web? And the two different pieces of this question are: develop a model that explains why some plants must be carnivorous if they can still use the sun's energy to perform photosynthesis. And then be sure to include how matter and energy are transferred and cycled within the system. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the different levels of rigor at the different grade level bands. And you are going to tell me if you think that this question is a K2, 3.5, 6.8, or 9.12. So in the chat, you can write K2 or 3.5 or 6.8 or 9.12, and then extra credit if you put why you think that is correct. So take a couple minutes, read this question, read these questions, and then write down K2, 3.5, 6.8, or 9.12 in the chat. Extra credit if you put Y. All right, what do you think, Kate? What do you think the breakdown is here? What are most people saying in the chat?
I see some pretty heavy 6-8 middle school presence here, but I see everything from 3-5 all the way to 9-12. And I actually see some pretty good rationale all the way through, which I find very interesting. It just goes to show how challenging this can be.
And therein lies the majority of the work that Kate and her team do, which is trying to figure out how we can write questions that meet an appropriate level of rigor for the grade level band that we are targeting. All right, great responses, y'all. I mean, as Kate mentioned, so I see 9.12 and 6.8, and I see 3.5 as well. So this question is intended and written to target the 6.8 grade level band. And so this is a 6.8 grade level band question. So I saw in the chat that folks mentioned that they're not testing and predicting, which is true, which I appreciate. However, you'll notice that it still says describe here in the 6.8 grade level band. And so a model doesn't have to describe, test, and predict. However, it does need to, it can describe at the 6.8 grade level band. And so the reason this is not 3.5 is that here we're looking at simple models and we're representing events and designing solutions. So this is a little bit more complex than a simple model. So I understand that photosynthesis, it may be a really familiar subject to you. However, there is nothing simple about photosynthesis. And then modeling also how that sun is this plant is carnivorous in addition to photosynthesis makes this an even more complex model than just saying sun energy, plant grow, other thing eat plant. So this is a little bit more complex because of that. And so this is not 9.12, Because, and I'm actually not going to answer that because there's going to be, there may be other questions that rely on this, but this is a discrete descriptive model of a process. It's an abstract phenomena, right? So we're looking at something, there's this carnivorous element, and there's also this element of photosynthesis that we include in here. So like this is pretty complex, but we rate this question as a 6-8 question, and it's because they are describing this abstract, the carnivorous element and the photosynthetic element. Great job, y'all. Okay, I love it. I love it. I love it. I love it. I'm trying not to give things away. And we're going to move on to our second question. Thank you for your participation and for your messages. Please, for this next one, make sure that you're sending messages to everyone. And so in the Zoom chat, I'll say two, and there'll be a little blue box that says everyone. If yours says two hosts and panelists, it's great to hear from you, but everyone else is missing your wonderful brain and all the thoughts you're sharing. So make sure you put to everyone. You click the little drop down there instead of to hosts and panelists. All right, question number 2. Why is Hawaii such a hot spot? Am I right? All right, but literally, like it's pretty hot there. So this phenomena is focused around the Hawaiian hotspot and the archipelago that Hawaii is a part of. And we asked students these 2 questions to answer. So the first question is, draw a model that shows how magma from deep within the Earth's mantle could reach the surface to form the Hawaiian Islands, even though they lie in the center of the Pacific plate. Second, be sure your model shows how matter and energy flow and cycle to produce the island chain. All right, now K2, 3, 5, 6, 8, or 9, 12 in the chat. Go. And please put why this time, because I feel like I gave you a little bit of like a justification for the last one. So I'd love to hear why you think it's one thing versus another. Okay, so if you're still writing something, don't feel like you have to stop. Kate, do you want to explain this one and go through the chat?
I would be happy to. I saw some really, really great points in the chat. And, the argument could be made, like, I just saw something like they're not revising it, but they're developing it, which looks like it's in the 6-8. But in 9-12, usually you're not using synthesizing and developing all at the same time. You're doing like one of those things. So while developing, we see at the 6-8 grade level band, and we see it at the 9-12 level band. The real kicker here for this one, and some people are starting to call this out, is that showing relationship among variables between systems and their components. In this case, we're looking at the natural world. So in this case, we are asking them to look at the relationship between matter and energy and how that helps us to explain the natural phenomena of the formation of the Hawaiian Islands. So many of you were right. I hope. If I get this wrong, I'm going to be really embarrassed. But many of you were right that I would say, from my content perspective, that this is a 9-12 high school question. Yeah. And mainly because of that showing relationships among variables in the system or between systems.
So I think one feature of the 6-8 grade level band is that we're looking at a system, and we're looking at one system. So it's going to be a little bit more discrete, like that one Venus flytrap, and looking at that one system. And what we're looking at here is the system of convection currents within the Earth, and then also this system of formation of these islands that's also happening, like above that system. And so there's a relationship between those 2 systems, and that right there that makes this a 9-12. And I think specifically, as Kate said, that what's the relationship between energy and matter in this is what really brings it up to a 9-12 level band. The cross-cutting concept is all about what's the relation, the movement of matter and energy are related, and changes in one of those things leads to changes in the other. And that's really a focus of the 9-12 level band. This isn't about the cross-cutting concept, this is about the SEP. And so even if you're not an earth science teacher, the idea is that all of these questions show there's some idea behind all of these questions, where if you look at the language of the question and you think about even the complexity of what students will have to do in the question, that ideally you can answer these questions. If you're like if you're a 3rd grade teacher and you're like, I don't really know, I didn't learn about this and I don't teach it, and that's totally fine. Great job, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kate, for going through that. Totally nailed it. And now we're just gonna hold our hammer for one more and see how we do on this one. So this phenomena is all about, why do we need the sun to see the moon? And what we want students to do here are identify which of the light diagrams correctly model the movement of light that allows us to see the moon. Same, but different. Write down your grade level band and then your justification for that grade level band in the chat. All right, I'm loving all the answers we have in here. I want to make sure that we move on. So this is really interesting because I see a lot of folks saying K2 and I see folks saying 3.5. And there's some differences that I'll highlight between those two different grade level bands that I think are really important here. And so one of those things is that in both of them, so similarity is that using and developing or building and revising are both in there, and that it says using models in 3.5, so using and developing or building and using are both in there. Now, something that's important here is that in K2, it says represent concrete events. So these are events that are concrete, and in conversations with folks who like worked on the standards and other folks, like these are things that are like really tangible for students, where like they can see them, they can feel them, they know they know them. And so something that's different about this is at 3.5, we start to see students representing events. So just any kind of event that is happening or designing solutions. And so for this model and for this question, because the process of light bouncing off of the moon and going to our eyes it's not really a concrete event. Like it's pretty abstract if you think about the fact that there's this well, I mean, it's not invisible. It is visible. That's how we see the moon. But there's this stuff that's moving around and we can't see it. We just see a reflection of that stuff, that's pretty abstract. I mean, really, when you really start to think about it, that's pretty abstract. And so we rate this question as a grade level 3.5. And the only reason is because it's not concrete. Because if this was a concrete event that students could like touch and feel and really know, that would be something absolutely would fall at the K2 level. So this we rate as a 3.5 grade level band. And Kate, do you want to add anything onto that?
The only thing I was going to say is because of the wording of the K2 to the 3.5, it's really that concrete events versus events is the only difference. That I actually think this was a really tough question for the participants, because you also have to know a little bit about when kids start to learn about like light and light waves too. So I think it could, I really like it's that explanation of like the light waves. That's not like a concrete thing. They can't touch it. They can't smell it. We can see the results of them traveling through space, but it's not a very concrete thing. However, kids also start to learn about like light waves in this way at a certain grade level. And so that also really takes, we are pulling dimensions apart here, but there is that little bit of a trickiness to answering this question as we posed it to you. So you all did an amazing job.
Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you so much, Kate, for that addition. I think these are really tough questions, and if you've been writing these questions on your own or you've been using other questions, then you probably know that it's pretty difficult to properly calibrate these questions. And by we, I mean truly Kate and her team have gone through 4 rounds of revising these different questions from what they started out as. And honestly, historically, they've been revised even more than that, because it's just as you reread the standards and you reread the questions, you'll see one word between the 6.8 and 9.12, or the 3.5 and the 6.8, or the K2 and the 3.5, and you'll say like that word is meant to differentiate those really concrete things I can see, feel, and touch. Like I can touch that thing, versus things that are less concrete, versus things that are really abstract, or relationships between two abstract things, which is like what the 9.12 grade level band is getting at. And so I guess now the question we want to pose is, all right, great. So there's these really complex questions, and those complex questions can be at different levels of rigor, but how can we scaffold up to modeling? And so what we want to present are a couple of different ways that we think about that scaffolding process. And so first off, I'm going to go through the ways that we scaffold different questions. And the focus here, instead of working up to sense making, is working up to modeling, really that SEP performance of modeling. And with Inner Orbit, we want to focus on gathering data towards that end. And I think it's really interesting to give students scaffold experiences, but if you can't do anything with where they fell off, then it can be really, really challenging to use that in a meaningful way. And so on Inner Orbit, we write different questions that are geared towards very different dimensions. And so one of those questions that we'll write are called our DCI only questions. We call them core content questions. And the idea is that we need to know if students know things. Like, do you know that light travels? And do you know that light travels in a very specific way? And that light can travel and hit something and then travel somewhere else. So that's an example of a thing that students need to know. In order to access that question, like they need to understand that. So that's great. That's representing their knowledge. And these are going to be multiple choice questions or drag and drop questions or, like simple questions that just say, do you know a thing? But we know that that's not evidence of proficiency. It's definitely not evidence of applying an SEP. We also write a different type of one-dimensional question, which are called our SEP practice problems. And these are questions that are doing. So the DCI is representing their understanding. The SEP is doing the thing. So, evaluate a limitation of this model, or, select the model that represents this abstract process. What would you change about this model? Or if this model changed in this way, what would that be? So these SEP practice problems, if you're not familiar with inner orbit, really focus on the skill of doing absent the content. And from an NGS's perspective, like this is, like anathema, like you cannot do this to demonstrate proficiency, which we are not at all saying that this is a demonstration of proficiency. We are saying you're practicing and scaffolding up, and you're gathering data on where students are being successful, where they need more support. So the SEP only questions that we have, that we call them SEP practice problems, we have them at grade level bands 3, 5, 6, 8, and 9, 12. We'll offer students ways of just doing. It's disconnected from sense making. It's disconnected from content. We look at like really weird things like, what if you wanted to build a zip line in your house? Or what about these mouse traps? Or I don't know, Kate, what's another one of your favorite SEP practice problem like phenomena?
I just love anything that's like sort of real world stuff. Like I think there's like the kid getting hurled from his skateboard type stuff and looking at like graphs of speed versus distance. Just cool stuff that's like kids can relate to because they've been there, done that, but they're not having to apply a really specific grade level science concept to think about why it might happen.
Yeah, it's not content driven. So that student flying off their skateboard, it's not content driven. It's really just focused on the SEP in all of that. And then what we do is we'll take those performances from those one-dimensional things, one-dimensional SEP, one-dimensional DCI, and we'll say, now let's write a two-dimensional question and say, okay, now can you combine your understanding of content and your understanding of the SEP and answer questions about applying the practice through the lens of modeling, for example. This is a way to engage students in the SEPs without having them go whole hog into sense making and three-dimensional questions. So they're not really explaining the how or why of the phenomena with these, but we're able to gather data and say, okay, can you take your knowledge and can you take your skills and can you put those together in a practice of blending those two in a two-dimensional question. These are our scaffolding questions that build up into three-dimensional questions. Those three-dimensional questions are rigorous questions. They come in multiple choice and they come in free response questions. The idea is that we can gather data on where students fall off in each of these things. And you could write questions on your own. You don't have to use an orbit for this, but this is just a way to conceptualize how can I get students up to that really advanced point. Let's ask them questions about the SCP, ask them questions about the DCI, ask them questions about just those two things and leave out the cross-cutting concept. And then we can ask them three-dimensional questions later on. And that's one way that we think about scaffolding. And so we write questions in this way. So this first question is about, how can we model the process of photosynthesis? This is a SEP only question. What's really interesting about this, because we talked about it a lot actually internally, is, is this question one-dimensional because it mentions photosynthesis? And so the question says, refer to Matthew's model. How would this model change if a volcano erupted nearby, blocking out 50% of the sun's rays? And now when you look at photosynthesis and you think about this, you probably think about it from a content perspective, not from a modeling perspective. So you want students to understand the content of what goes into it and what comes out. But from a modeling perspective, we're looking at inputs, we're looking at outputs. And so we can look at the change in the inputs and the change that would have on the outputs without understanding those relationships in a meaningful way. And this question is not asking about, like the molecules of this that will be impacted by that, or like what part of photosynthesis will be impacted. This is an inputs and an outputs question using that model. And so here we're asking students just about the SEP of developing these models. We're not actually asking about photosynthesis at all. We're able to sort of like pare away the DCI and the cross-cutting concept. And this is a one-dimensional SEP question. So saying like, can you tell me using this model what's going to happen between the inputs and the outputs? If you know about photosynthesis, or if you don't, then you can still answer this question. And so then we can scaffold a little bit further with students' content, understanding, okay, so maybe they have the SCP skills they need. Now let's see if they understand the DCI. So this is a separate phenomena about how do trees survive the winter. So we'll say, like when trees do not have leaves, they cannot perform the process of photosynthesis. Where do they get the energy to stay alive during these times? Photosynthesis is not where plants get their energy from. They get their energy from cellular respiration. That's where the actual active energy comes in. And so this is a middle school level content only question about energy flow in organisms. And here we're not asking about the SEP. There's no models that they need to go through. There is a model here, but they don't need to use this for that. They're not using the cross-cutting concept in a meaningful way. And thus this is a content only question. And if we can validate that students have content, and we can validate that students have an understanding of the SEP, then we can ask two-dimensional questions. We call these content and practices questions. So Sean is trying to create a model of cellular respiration, but is having a hard time including energy. He asks how energy could be included in a scientific model if it's not made of matter or anything we can see. What can you tell Sean? And so this is looking at not only their understanding of cellular respiration, but also their understanding of models. And so here, this is a two-dimensional question asking about this unobservable mechanism and the chemical reactions within cellular respiration. We're not asking about the cross-cutting concept in a meaningful way. We have other questions that ask about that. But this can be a scaffold to get them up to the point where now they're answering three-dimensional questions. We call those questions sense making on inner orbit, and there are two different flavors of those. So one are multiple choice questions. This says, which of these things that we cannot see with our eyes should be included in a model of cellular respiration? Matter being destroyed and energy being created, molecules being broken down and rearranged, energy being stored and released. So we need students to understand using the model of cellular respiration. They need to understand energy, matter, and flows, and they need to understand the concept of the fact that chemical reactions break things down. So this is a three-dimensional sense-making question that is multiple choice. And then we have free response questions around sense-making as well. Draw a model to show how trees get the energy they need to survive cold winters without their leaves. You can draw things that are big enough to see with your eyes in the tree and things that are too small to see in the circle. Think of it as a cell. Be sure your model includes, and then we have a list of the things that your model should include. So this is an example of a three-dimensional sense-making question where students have to actually construct a model. And in each of these questions, you can see how we're slowly sort of like building up the base of, do you have knowledge and the skills that you need and the practices? Can you blend those two things together? And then can you access higher level questions? And each of these questions is tagged with really specific parts of the standards. And so this question is intended to give you an example of DCI, SEP, and cross-cutting concept information. And that will all feed into the reports on inner orbit. And I can go over those later, but that is the idea. So in the chat, somebody asked, can I connect with this with DOK? It's really interesting. So depth of knowledge and sense making are similar in some ways, but different. Kate, do you want to take that question and answer it? I'm happy to do it.
I don't know if I want to take it. I know that this has been a topic of discussion for us. I think there are similarities and differences is what I would say. I would not say that there's a direct correlation between like a one-dimensional question and a certain level of depth of knowledge. And I think that's why we were really clear with our definition about rigor earlier. And when we're talking about rigor, what we're really talking about is those different grade level bands for the SEP specifically. But I do think there are similarities and differences. And I think there could be a whole webinar on that once we find the research to support it. Yeah.
I think like one big thing that we see, and this is just something to look out for as you look at questions, is there's a big difference between sort of the level of rigor of a question and the level of sense making of a question. And so just a note is that like you give students a huge project, and what you talked about in class can be really in depth. They could have to do a lot of research to explain this thing that you talked about in class. And that can be a very rigorous activity for students to undergo, but it doesn't mean they're making sense of something new. And this is really important. And so providing experiences for sense making is different than giving students high rigor activities. And it's just important to note that and I think DOK is maybe, this is where it's sense making kind of like drifts from that, which is that it's all through a new context. And so like you could analyze a model, you could do something, you could synthesize a model that you talked about in class. And that could be a rigorous thing. It'd be like a high level Bloom's or like DOK, but that doesn't mean they're making sense of a novel thing and explaining why or how with their model. And that's like a separate thing. And so I think an important thing to call out whenever I see people comparing like Bloom's or DOK to the NGS sense making is that those two things are pretty different. That one was looking at rigor and making sure students are doing things that are rigorous enough. And the other is looking at can students take their knowledge and transfer it to a different thing. And there's some like DOK level 3 and 4 things where absolutely students are sense making, but some of those things are, yeah. are really focused around just making things rigor enough. All right, I digress. Let's dive into our next session, which is focused around scaffolding SEPs. Thank you, Kate, for keeping me on track. Now I'm going to pass it over to Kate, talk a little bit about some of the structures that Kate's been building around scaffolding SEPs.
No, thank you, Brendan. And it's it's important to have these conversations about the background, and they're great questions popping up in the chat. So I'm glad we have time to pop in and talk about those. So okay. So we've gone through all of this, and like other than using questions on orbit, right? Like how can I scaffold sense making for my students? And one of the things that we're talking about here is scaffolding a practice specifically. So for all the wonderful information that Brendan just brought to us, the big question here is like, why should we even scaffold a science practice, like rather than a DCI or a CCC? I'm not going to get too much into those other dimensions in this webinar, but we do have resources that you can go to learn more about that. So one of the first reasons is that many students still think about science as a set of facts and words that they need to know and like sort of regurgitate or represent back to us. And while representation is really, really important in science, like we have to go through that phase of learning, it's a pretty straightforward way of thinking about science, and it's fairly low rigor when we like, speaking of DOKs, it's fairly low on that DOK scale. So it's also not really terribly engaging or true to life. Like science isn't just knowing, right? So we have to decide what to do to approach a complex phenomena or problem. And this can be really, really elusive for students who are not used to three-dimensional learning. So if we can help students successfully access and practice science practices, we can help them move from knowing to doing and start facilitating that transition from representing to sense making. And this is, again, we're helping students break down what scientists do with their content knowledge to make sense of new to them things in the real world, like what Brendan was just talking about. And lastly, by scaffolding the practice, we are trying to eliminate some of that unproductive struggle that we see students go through when they're presented with complex problems and they have to give an answer or produce a model all at once. And we're moving them more into that like zone of proximal development. And again, just to be clear, that is that space in between what students can do autonomously with no help and what they are really not able to do yet. And we know from research that this is the brain space where, learning becomes like engaging and sticky. And so scaffolding, we know, is one strategy for keeping students in that zone. So what does this look like? Like, what does this look like in instruction and what does this look like in practice? Well, let's explore what it looks like by digging into a high school earth science performance expectation from the NGSS. And this particular performance expectation asks students to develop a model based on evidence of Earth's interior to describe the cycling of matter by thermal convection. Okay, that's a mouthful. But in order to approach proficiency, students need to know DCI, like content, facts, and ideas about Earth's materials and systems and plate tectonics and the properties of waves. Those DCI elements we see bulleted there in the orange box. They also must look at and think about the phenomena through the lens of the cross-cutting concept. And in this case, that's energy driving the cycling of matter. So we've got what they need to know, we've got how they need to look at it, and what we're trying to scaffold for them here, and what the big question for you've heard this all from your students, but what do you want me to do, right? So let's approach that, because students in this case have to do the SEP that we've been talking about, of developing a model to illustrate the relationship between parts of a system. We want them to apply their understanding of those DCI elements to something new. So they probably have not studied in your class the formation of this whaleback in the volcanic crater of Mount St. Helens. Maybe they have. Sounds like your class would be super fun. But if they haven't, this would be a really great novel thing for them to apply their understanding to and try to make sense of how it happened. But that's really hard. That's really hard. And so we can scaffold this for students, and we can do it using 3 different things that we know from research that scientific models need to have. Scientific models need to have parts or components, the things that are in a model, right? What are the actual things we're trying to represent? They need to have interactions and behaviors and relationships. How are those things interacting with each other, or how do they behave in the system? And then eventually we get to mechanisms, or a simpler way to think about that is like the explanation of the phenomena, right? Those are the things that models need to do in order to be a really good scientific model. And we're going to look at a series of 3 questions that we can use to access each of these parts of the model. And we're going to the questions are on the screen, but we're going to dive into them here with our example. So let's get to it. Okay, so Now we're looking at our actual whaleback example. And our guiding question for the parts, this is where we're going to kick students off. This is where we're going to get them started, is what are the things we need to put in our model and how do we want to show them? So what that might look like is what you can see here on Brendan's screen. The kids are starting to think of ways to represent things like magma and energy, which is something that we can't see, and radioactive decay, which they're all like, kids are all excited. Ooh, we know a symbol for that. Like we're going to use we're going to use that cool symbol that we saw on that TV show one time, whatever. But what we're really getting at here for students is like, we are going to take this really, really complex thing. And the place we're going to start is by figuring out what needs to go in our model and how we're going to represent it, even down to how we're going to represent the different layers of the earth, such as the core and the crust, right? So you can see that starting to develop here and really helping students develop that key of here's all the important parts. We're not showing interactions yet. We're just getting started. And this scaffold of like, what are the things? When we talk about rigor, this is a little bit low rigor. We're scaffolding the science practice for them, but we're also activating their content knowledge for them. And so you're going to see how that starts to come together in a minute. When we move to interactions and behaviors, we're going to ask students another guiding question, which is like, how do these parts interact with each other and how do we want to represent that? For example, you can see here we've started to like add the volcano structure onto the crust, right? Like this is a part of the crust, but we have to leave space for magma to move through and become lava. And why is the magma moving? Oh, the magma is moving because of convection. So we need to show some movement there in the magma, right? We need to show some movement in the mantle. And why is it moving? Oh, it's driven by some radioactive decay and some energy being produced in the core. So we need to show that too. And you can see that we're starting to move away from just the parts of the model, and we're starting to show some interactions that are going to help us with our explanation. And lastly, the question we're going to ask students, and to really get them into mechanisms and explanations, is what like drives the parts to interact in this way. And this is where students are really accessing like their understanding of like pretty heavy scientific ideas or theories, our laws, like gravity, for example. Are the things interacting this way because of the laws of gravity? Or are animals interacting in this way, or are populations changing in this way because of the theory of evolution? Just to give some examples. So they might start writing down things like, well, we have convection currents that are driven by energy from radioactive decay that are causing the mantle, the magma, and the mantle to move. And as we go through these bullet points, there's something highlighted in yellow here. And what I really want to point out is kids might come up with phrases and ideas during this mechanistic explanation that aren't represented in the model yet. And that's a really great tool that we can use to facilitate a lot of great discussions in our classroom and to keep revising our model until we get to the right, and I hate to say right answer, until we get to an answer that we can all agree upon. So I'm going to pause here because we would love to pose a question to you in the chat. And Brendan's going to put that on the screen as well. And that question is, how do you see this structure of breaking down modeling, like this big practice of breaking it down into 3 parts with 3 or 4, if you want to look at that one question as 2 questions. How do you see the structure of breaking that CP down into these 3 parts with 3 guiding questions, helping your students make sense of phenomena? Or in other words, how do you see the structure helping your students approach sense making? So I'll give a couple minutes and we'll let folks put their answers in the chat. So thanks for being brave. I love seeing someone being the first person willing to pop an idea in the chat. That's awesome. I know we're getting tight on our time here, and I'm super excited to see what some of you have to say about how you see this helping your students. I see breaking it down in this way to make it easier to guide students to develop quality models on a practical level. I think that's really important. Like my nightmare as a kid was being asked to draw a model because I can't draw. And I thought I had to create like a realistic representation of what I was like seeing. Like I was gonna have to redraw the whaleback and also draw all the different layers inside, like in great detail. And we'll get into, but I think that's, Aaron, such a great point, and I love that. And I also see like giving them the tools that they need and a baseline to approach the steps to higher level thinking. Like these are fantastic answers. And I think what that can also lead to is, I sort of hinted at this earlier, but like facilitating productive discourse. We talk about that a lot when we talk about 3-dimensional science, but like really having a baseline for your kids to start talking about, like, do we agree or do we disagree? Is this what we, is this what we want to represent? Is this how we want to represent it? And does this explain the phenomena? We're also moving away from like those short representational answers, or even from long representational answers, into like really making sense of how something like this could form. See a lot of like baseline stuff and scaffolding and chunking. And yeah, that's exactly right. So let's really quickly, to wrap this section up, talk about what we did do and what we didn't do. And some of you have already sort of like hit on this in the chat, but I'm pretty excited to talk about it. So we have generated a set of questions that you can use with your students and that they can use like as a thinking routine anytime they need to approach the practice of modeling, right? Like they can use this again and again and again, regardless of the content, like the DCI content that they're accessing. What we have not done is ask students to create a realistic representation, the Kate nightmare, of the system using complex drawing or technical skills. So we have also scaffolded students thinking about what they have to do so they can apply what they know, right? What do I have to know and what do I have to do? Now we're breaking down what they have to do so they can access and apply what they know. And they're doing this in order to access, or in order to like make sense of that complex phenomena or solve complex problems. We have not required that students make sense of the phenomena or solve the problem all at once. So in other words, we haven't just slapped that big free response question down in front of them and said, okay, draw a model. They will have to do that. They will have to do that when they like sit down to take a high stakes assessment or a summative assessment. They'll have to do that. But for right now, we can scaffold them up to that. And lastly, we've created a format in which partial success or partial proficiency demonstration is attainable, even if they can't yet fully create a mechanistic model. We need to move kids from one place to another, and we have to do that in steps. We have not done is place students in like an all or nothing situation where they can only be right or only be wrong by representing facts exactly the way that they learned them. Now, when we take this all the way through to looking back to our performance expectation, which I think is really important, it's important for us to think about the fact that we, first of all, have done like something really kind of magical, and we've scaffolded what students need to do, again, so that they can apply what they know to make sense of something new to them. We just mentioned that in the previous slide. Another thing we've done is we've actually like already leveraged 2 of these 3 DCI elements just to get them to get the list of the things that they have to represent. Like we've already activated all of that knowledge just to get them started on their parts of their model, which I think is very, very cool. It also gives us a chance to formatively assess, are all the parts there that need to be there? So that's pretty neat as well. And lastly, every student in your class, after doing this thinking routine a few times, should be able to at least partially answer the question of how the whalebat gets inside the volcano, even if they can't come up with a fully mechanistic model. We've given them a place to start and a place to end where they can still be successful. And I'm going to kick it back over to Brendan to close us off.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you so much, everyone. We're very, very grateful for you taking the time and being here. I know we're a couple minutes over, and I just want to be cognizant of that. If you'd like to meet with us and chat about Inner Orbit, you can use that calendar link in the chat that I just dropped in there. Soon, you will see an invite coming into your inboxes for the introduction and also a scaffolding the SEPs, analyzing interpreting data. We're going to do the same thing, but different, again, with a different SEP, because we think there's a lot that we can go into by diving into these SEPs. And hopefully it helps you to see a little bit more about what this looks like. If you want to explore or take a look at Inner Orbit on your own, you do not have to. You don't have to meet with us. You can use this link right here. And otherwise, we're super grateful that y'all took the time to be with us and grow your practice and put yourself out there for answering those questions that we pose to you. Thank you so much for being here, everyone, and have a beautiful day. Take care.